Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and welcome to Fully Equipped. Chapter 15 is an important one in the book of Acts. We read about what is called the Jerusalem Council, where they discuss the conditions for inviting the Gentiles into the church. They decide that following the law of Moses and becoming circumcised are not necessary for church membership. And finally, Paul heads out on his second missionary journey. So in this chapter, we're focusing a lot on the relationship between Judaism and the church, and on the law versus faith and grace. And we get to read more about James, the eponymous author of the book we're going to study next. Chapters 13 and 14 described Paul's fruitful ministry to the Gentiles throughout the nearby regions. Up until this point, the church has been predominantly made up of Jewish believers. But now, with the church beginning to expand with Gentile people as well, some of the Jewish believers raise concern. They have questions. Do the Gentiles have to first become Jews before becoming part of the church? And do they have to follow the law of Moses after becoming Christians? A lot of this division between Jews and Gentiles comes from the Pharisees, who are the ones who care a lot about the law and trying to earn their righteousness. In their eyes, if someone had to follow all of the laws like being circumcised in order to convert to Judaism, then they should also do those things in order to become part of the church. If you want some more context on why circumcision especially was a big issue that they were raising, go back and read Genesis chapter 17. But because they can't seem to reach a conclusion, Paul and Barnabas and some others are sent to Jerusalem to discuss with the apostles and elders and the whole church. Peter stands up at the Jerusalem Council and he gives a speech defending the Gentile mission. Peter reminds them that God had spoken to him with the vision of the sheet, and through him the Gentiles came to hear and believe the word. At the same time, God gave the Gentiles the Holy Spirit, which proved to them that they were truly saved just as the Jews were. The Gentiles at Cornelius' house were not saved or given the Holy Spirit after being circumcised. They were saved at the moment that they put their faith in Jesus. Peter asks these Jewish believers why they want the Gentiles to bear the heavy yoke of the law that nobody in their history has been able to fulfill. Peter's not saying that the law was a bad thing, or that God was a cruel master in giving it to them. He's saying that Jesus' yoke is easy, and his burden is light. He offers the gracious gift of salvation. And so there's no reason for the Jews to demand that the Gentiles follow the law, when they themselves are unable to do so. Paul and Barnabas also testify to the Gentile inclusion without need for the law of Moses or circumcision. They share the signs and wonders that God had blessed the Gentile people with. Then we read about James's speech. Reminder that this James is the half-brother of Jesus. James initially wasn't a follower of Jesus, but he witnessed Jesus after his resurrection. And it seems like after his resurrection, then James put his faith in Jesus. And now he's an important leader in the church. It's also interesting because we know from the writings of the historian Josephus and one of the early church fathers that James kept the Jewish law quite strictly. But here, even he agrees that the Gentiles should not be expected to keep the law. So even though there was division present between Jews and Gentiles in the early church, it wasn't between all of them. Many of the Jewish believers would have been united with the Gentile believers. Much of the division would have been as a result of the more hardline Jews. James uses the Old Testament prophets to explain why he believes Gentiles shouldn't have to do things like be circumcised. He quotes from the prophet Amos to show that God had spoken of a time when God would call Gentiles into relationship with him. He's quoting this to show that the time is now. So James proposes a solution. They should write a letter to the Gentile believers sharing what they must do. They're not required to keep all of the ceremonial laws, like being circumcised. But because there will be some Jewish believers who still keep all of these laws, or Jews that have not yet received Jesus, The Gentiles should try not to offend them so that fellowship is possible between these two groups. In order to build greater unity between the believers, the Gentiles should follow a few specific things. They should not eat food that has been offered to idols or meat with blood in it. And they should also live a sexually pure lifestyle. Remember that James's judgment on the situation is contextually based. Paul later permitted believers to eat food offered to idols, for example. Does that mean that Paul is contradicting James? No, it's just because James is aware that some things are more of an issue for the church at this point. Nowadays, if we eat meat offered to an idol, it's not likely that we'll be offending any Jews, so we have freedom under Christ to do so if we choose to. James also commands against sexual immorality because that was a big issue for the Gentile people of the time. For example, a lot of worship of pagan gods involved prostitution at their temples. So James is emphasizing that this is an aspect of the law that they do need to stick to. The ceremonial law might have gone away when the new covenant came in, but the moral law, which sexual purity is a part of, is something that reflects God's unchanging character and values. So the Gentiles need to be reminded to abstain from sexual immorality. And so the church's position on this is a balance of liberty and love. Yes, we have freedom under Christ, but sometimes it's a good idea to limit our liberty for the sake of love. The church agrees with James's position. They send some of the men back to Antioch with a letter outlining everything they've just discussed. They shared that the Holy Spirit has guided them in their discussion, and they've been led to decide that the Gentiles should not have to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses in order to be part of the church. When the church at Antioch receives this letter, they're greatly encouraged. Judas and Silas prophetically encourage the believers as well. These two men are called prophets. They are particularly gifted in speaking what the Holy Spirit reveals to them. Later, these two return to Jerusalem, and sometime afterwards Paul suggests to Barnabas that they leave Antioch as well. This is where the story of Paul's second missionary journey begins. Unfortunately, this journey does not start off on the best foot. Paul asks Barnabas to accompany him again to go and visit the churches they had begun when they preached the word throughout the surrounding regions. Remember how on the first missionary journey, John Mark had been with them, but went back to Jerusalem partway through? This causes a problem between Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas wants John Mark to come along, but Paul doesn't think he should join because he wasn't with them for a lot of the journey. As a result of this difference of opinion, they actually choose to go their separate ways. Paul takes Silas with him, and Barnabas takes John Mark. Some people take this to mean that they were really angry with one another, but it's also quite possible that they just had a friendly disagreement. And actually, God uses this to double the impact that they're able to have. So Paul goes back to the churches that he went to on his first missionary journey, and he's able to encourage and strengthen them in their faith as well. So how does this equip us? The disagreement over Gentile inclusion in the church was a pretty big one for the early church. And today, we still have many disagreements over things. That's why we have denominations. There are things that the Bible isn't super clear on. There are situations that we encounter in modern times that we don't have a scriptural basis for. There are things that we care about in the 21st century that they didn't care about back then. And this means that it's easy for disagreements to arise. When we talk about managing disagreements within the church, Acts chapter 15 provides an interesting example for us. It shows that it's good to hear different opinions. It's good to use what we do have from the Bible to influence our decision making. It's best to rely on the Holy Spirit's guidance. And it's good to make decisions based on what is most loving to another person. It's good to lay down our rights and our preferences to bring greater unity to the church. There was no law to say that the Gentiles couldn't eat meat with blood in it, but James said that it would be good for them to abstain because it would be most loving to the Jews. They should lay down this right for the good of the church. Think about what rights and preferences we have today in our cultures. Do any of them lead to disunity in the church? How can we manage or reduce disagreements within the church by laying these things down? Let's be people who love one another by putting each other first and acting in humility, all for the glory of God and the good of His church.